Alan Francis Brooke was not the type of soldier who sought the spotlight, yet history thrust him into one of the most decisive roles of the Second World War. Born in 1883 into an Anglo-Irish family with a long tradition of military service, Brooke grew up in a world where the British Empire seemed unshakable. His early years as an artillery officer in the First World War shaped him profoundly. On the Western Front, he learned two lessons that would never leave him: the terrible price of poor planning and the necessity of cool, precise coordination between infantry, artillery, and air support. These were not abstract ideas for him. They were the difference between survival and slaughter in the mud of the Somme. By the late 1930s, as Europe slid toward another war, Brooke had already built a reputation as a brilliant artillery commander and a man of sharp intellect. He wasn't charismatic in the Churchillian sense, but colleagues often described him as razor-sharp, pragmatic, and fiercely honest. When he looked at maps of France in 1939, he already foresaw trouble. The French lines were brittle, the German Wehrmacht was bold, and the British Expeditionary Force, BEF, would never be strong enough to stand alone. While many officers clung to hope, Brooke kept a realist's eye on the balance of forces. Britain had only 10 divisions in France, while Germany could muster over 100. It was like trying to block a flood with a handful of sandbags. When war erupted in 1939, Brooke was given command of 2nd Corps of the BEF. It was a thankless assignment, defending the rolling plains of Belgium against the most modern army in Europe. Yet here, Brooke's clarity of thought proved invaluable. As the German blitzkrieg swept through the Ardennes in May 1940, cutting the Allied front in two, panic spread like wildfire. Some commanders froze, others clung to orders that no longer made sense. Brooke, however, adapted. He withdrew his forces skillfully, buying time for the mass evacuation at Dunkirk. He was not a man who won glory in that campaign. Indeed, the BEF was forced to retreat. But his discipline and decisiveness ensured that Britain's army lived to fight another day. In this sense, Brooke's early war career was not about winning grand victories, but about preventing catastrophe. He was, as one observer later remarked, the man who kept the house from burning down while others searched for the fire brigade. When Alan Brooke returned from France in the summer of 1940, Britain stood on the edge of the abyss. The BEF had been saved, but barely. Europe had fallen: Poland, Norway, Denmark, the Low Countries, and now France. Across the Channel stood Hitler's armies, triumphant and seemingly unstoppable. The British Army was exhausted, stripped of much of its heavy equipment abandoned in the Dunkirk beaches, and morale trembled. It was in this bleak moment that Brooke began his ascent toward the highest military office in the land. At first, he was appointed to command British forces in Northern Ireland, a posting that might have seemed marginal, but in those days invasion threats were everywhere, and Belfast's ports were vital to Britain's Atlantic lifeline. Yet even as he organized defenses, others in Whitehall recognized his clarity of thought. Unlike some generals who indulged in grand rhetoric, Brooke was methodical, brutally realistic, and never afraid to confront uncomfortable truths. By the end of 1941, when the war had expanded to the Mediterranean and now the Pacific, Brooke was chosen as Chief of the Imperial General Staff, SIGS, effectively the professional head of the British Army. This was not a glamorous role. He was not leading troops in the field, not the man photographed in a desert uniform on the cover of newspapers. Instead, Brooke worked in the shadows, sitting at the War Cabinet table with Winston Churchill. And here began one of the most fascinating and often tense partnerships of the war. Churchill was a whirlwind of ideas, energy, and sheer willpower. He might suggest 5 grand schemes before breakfast: an invasion of Norway, a landing in the Balkans, an armored thrust through the Caucasus. Some of these notions were brilliant, others wildly impractical. Brooke became, in his own words, the brake on Churchill's impulses. Where the Prime Minister's imagination leapt to distant theaters, Brooke's mind returned to the cold arithmetic of divisions, shipping tonnage, and supply lines. The British Army simply did not have the resources to fight everywhere at once. This did not make their relationship easy. The two men argued furiously, sometimes with raised voices that startled even hardened cabinet ministers. Churchill once described Brooke as "my torment," while Brooke wrote in his private diary that the Prime Minister was like a naughty child who had to be kept in order. Yet the friction between them produced a strange kind of balance. Churchill supplied the vision and relentless drive. Brooke supplied the discipline and strategic logic that kept Britain's war effort anchored in reality. One of the earliest clashes came over the question of where to strike Germany after 1941. Churchill dreamed of striking at the soft underbelly of Europe, through the Mediterranean, the Balkans, or the Aegean Islands. Brooke, on the other hand, was convinced that the only decisive theater would be northern France. He compared alternative schemes to playing sideshows at a fair while ignoring the main stage. The Wehrmacht could only be broken by a massive cross-channel invasion, but only once Britain and her allied Americans had the strength to sustain it. This meant waiting, consolidating, and resisting the temptation to squander divisions inside campaigns. This tension between these visions shaped much of 1942 and 1943. When British troops fought in North Africa, Brooke supported the campaign, but with a wary eye. He knew the resources committed there were limited, but the political need for victory was overwhelming. Britain needed a win, and Montgomery's triumph at El Alamein in late 1942 delivered it. Brooke celebrated that victory, but also reminded his colleagues that El Alamein, for all its glory, was still a peripheral battle compared to the clash that would one day come in France. Meanwhile, Brooke sat at the heart of Allied strategy conferences: Casablanca, Washington, Quebec, Tehran. There he wrestled not only with Churchill, but with American counterparts, above all, General George Marshall. Marshall pressed hard for an immediate invasion of France, arguing that delay only prolonged the suffering and gave Germany time to fortify. Brooke countered with hard numbers. In 1942, the Allies had nowhere near the shipping, landing craft, or trained divisions to succeed. Attempting an invasion then, he argued, would be a disaster on the scale of Dunkirk or worse. It was better to build up, to bleed Germany in secondary theaters, and to wait until overwhelming force was ready. His caution may have frustrated the Americans, but time proved him right. When D-Day finally came in 1944, it was under conditions of Allied supremacy that made success possible. Brooke's strategic vision thus shaped the broad arc of the war. He was not a battlefield commander like Montgomery or Slim, whose names were cheered in newspapers. Instead, he was the man who orchestrated the grand chess game, ensuring that Britain's limited pieces were moved with maximum effect. At times, his role seemed thankless. He often went to bed feeling exhausted, sometimes even despairing. His diary reveals deep doubts. He feared Britain was being overshadowed by America, that Churchill's impulsiveness might undo everything, that his own efforts were invisible. And yet, through those dark nights, he remained the linchpin of Britain's war direction. If Churchill was the voice of defiance, Brooke was the architect of survival. Without him, Britain might have lunged into reckless operations that drained its strength. With him, the nation endured, rebuilt, and prepared the way for ultimate victory. By 1943, Field Marshal Alan Brooke had become the central brain of Britain's military machine. Though he never led an army in the field after France, his influence stretched across every major theater. From Cairo to Burma, from Sicily to Normandy, Brooke's fingerprints lay on the plans that determined the fate of millions. One of the fiercest debates he faced was over the Mediterranean. After El Alamein and the Axis collapse in North Africa, the question arose, where next? Churchill pressed hard for a landing in Italy, a thrust into what he called the soft underbelly of Europe. Brooke, ever a realist, doubted the softness. Italy's geography, with its mountainous spine and narrow valleys, was a defender's dream. He warned that an advance up the peninsula would be slow, costly, and yield only limited strategic rewards. Still, political pressure and the need to keep momentum with the Americans made Italy inevitable. Brooke's prediction proved grimly accurate. The Allies did land in Sicily in July 1943 and then on the Italian mainland, but far from collapsing like a house of cards, German forces dug in with ferocity. Cassino, Anzio, the Gustav Line, names that became synonymous with grinding attrition. In his diary, Brooke lamented that the campaign absorbs far too many divisions for far too small a result. Yet even as he criticized, he ensured the army was supplied, reinforced, and ultimately victorious. By 1945, Italy was liberated, but Brooke's caution had been vindicated. What looked like a soft underbelly had turned out to be an armored chest. While the Mediterranean campaign dragged on, Brooke turned his full attention to the operation he believed would decide the war: the cross-channel invasion, Operation Overlord. Planning began in earnest in 1943, with Brooke constantly balancing competing pressures. The Americans eager for speed and scale, the British cautious but determined, and the Soviets desperately demanding a second front to relieve pressure on the Eastern Front. Brooke's strategic mind was relentless in detail. He insisted that the invasion not be rushed until overwhelming superiority was achieved. He argued that the Allies needed at least a 5-to-1 advantage in landing craft, artillery, and air power before facing the German divisions entrenched along the Atlantic Wall. He drew comparisons to earlier disasters: Gallipoli in 1915, where poor preparation led to slaughter, or Dieppe in 1942, where a small-scale raid had ended in bloodshed. "We must not repeat Dieppe on a continental scale," he warned. By 1944, thanks to American industrial might and meticulous Anglo-American coordination, the conditions Brooke demanded were finally met. Though he would not command troops on D-Day itself, his fingerprints shaped every part of the plan. The choice of Normandy over the Pas de Calais, the vast deception schemes that misled German intelligence, and the insistence on building artificial harbors, the mulberries, to keep the invasion supplied. When the landings came on June 6, 1944, Brooke sat in London tense and exhausted. Success was never guaranteed. For the first days, the Allies clung to their beachheads with difficulty, and the shadow of disaster loomed. Brooke paced rooms, chain-smoking, his nerves worn thin. But gradually, the bridgehead expanded. By late July, Montgomery's breakout at Caen and Patton's dash into Brittany confirmed that Overlord had succeeded. Brooke felt vindicated. Years of restraint, argument, and careful preparation had finally paid off. Yet victory was never simple. The campaign in Northwest Europe turned into a race between Allied ambition and German resistance. Brooke clashed again with Churchill over Operation Market Garden in September 1944, the bold plan to seize bridges in the Netherlands. He doubted it could succeed. The plan demanded too much from lightly armed airborne troops and underestimated German resilience. History proved him right. Arnhem became a bridge too far, and the Allies suffered a stinging defeat. Beyond Asia, Brooke also oversaw British strategy in Asia. The Japanese advance had humiliated the empire in 1941 through 42, capturing Hong Kong, Malaya, and Burma. Brooke pushed for the rehabilitation of British forces in India, supporting General William Slim, who eventually rebuilt the 14th Army into a formidable force. At Imphal and Kohima in 1944, Slim's men turned back the Japanese in battles often compared to Stalingrad for their intensity. Brooke admired Slim greatly, calling him one of the finest commanders Britain produced. Still, Asia always remained a secondary theater for him. The real prize, he believed, was the defeat of Nazi Germany. Looking back, one might say Brooke rarely won or lost battles in the traditional sense. His victories were often measured in preventing disasters, aligning resources, and keeping Britain's war effort coherent in the face of immense strain. He had no El Alamein to his name, no grand battlefield to immortalize him. Instead, his triumphs were in the shadows, persuading Roosevelt and Marshall to wait until 1944 for Overlord, tempering Churchill's impulses, ensuring British exhausted divisions were not hurled into hopeless adventures. By the time the Reich collapsed in May 1945, Alan Brooke had become, in the eyes of many military historians, the architect of Britain's survival and ultimate success. But in his own eyes, he felt drained, often doubting whether he had done enough, sometimes haunted by the soldiers who had fallen in campaigns he had tried to prevent.
When the war ended in May 1945, Alan Brooke stood at the pinnacle of his profession. He had been raised to the peerage as Viscount Alan Brooke, hailed by fellow officers as one of the greatest military minds of his generation. Yet victory, for him, carried a bitter aftertaste. The Britain he had fought for was exhausted, nearly bankrupt, and already overshadowed by the rising power of the United States and the Soviet Union. For a man who had dedicated his life to preserving the empire's role as a world power, the dawning post-war reality was sobering. Brooke left his post as Chief of the Imperial General Staff shortly after the war's end. Unlike Churchill, who remained in politics to fight for his premiership, Brooke had no taste for political office. He was weary, scarred by years of strategic battles in smoky cabinet rooms, and perhaps too blunt to play the games of peacetime politics. Instead, he sought solace in quieter pursuits. Away from the War Office, Brooke turned to his old passions: nature, birdwatching, and the countryside. To those who knew him, the contrast was striking. The man who had once juggled the destinies of armies now found joy in the song of a thrush or the sight of migrating geese over English fields. He became president of the Zoological Society of London, a role he relished with genuine enthusiasm. Where once he had calculated divisions and tonnage, he now counted nesting pairs and migratory patterns. But Brooke also remained deeply reflective about the war. In private, he began writing his diaries, which he had kept meticulously during the conflict. These journals, sometimes sharp, sometimes bitter, revealed a man torn between pride and frustration. He admired Churchill's leadership, but often criticized his recklessness. He respected the Americans, but worried about Britain's waning influence. He celebrated Allied victory, yet grieved for the endless waste of lives. Decades later, when his diaries were published, they shocked some with their candor, but also cemented his reputation as one of the most intellectually honest voices of the war. Though retired from active duty, Brooke was still honored by his peers. In 1946, he was appointed Knight of the Garter, one of Britain's highest orders of chivalry. He attended state ceremonies, gave lectures, and was consulted occasionally on military matters, though never again with the same authority. He grew close to a circle of intellectuals and naturalists, preferring long walks and evenings of conversation to the pomp of political life. Yet health was not always kind to him. The immense stress of the war years had taken its toll. He suffered from heart problems in later life, and his once formidable energy slowly waned. On 17 June 1963, Alan Brooke died at the age of 79. Britain mourned him with dignity, but without the fanfare reserved for Churchill 2 years later. He was buried in Northern Ireland, close to the landscapes of his youth, far from the battlefields he had helped to shape from afar. History has often wrestled with how to remember Alan Brooke. Unlike Montgomery or Eisenhower, he never commanded armies in decisive battles. Unlike Churchill or Roosevelt, he never stirred nations with speeches. His war was fought not with rifles or rhetoric, but with maps, memoranda, and long arguments in conference halls. Yet many historians argue that without his steady hand, Britain's war effort might have collapsed into chaos or squandered itself in futile adventures. Brooke was the strategic anchor in a storm of ambition and desperation. He was the man who dared tell Churchill no when few others had the courage to. He was the planner who ensured that when Britain finally struck across the Channel, it did so with overwhelming strength rather than reckless haste. And he was the realist who understood that the war was not just about winning battles, but about preserving the nation's ability to endure. In the end, Alan Brooke left behind no battlefield monument, no glorious headline victory. His monument was more subtle: the survival of Britain, the victory of the Allies, and the careful strategy that made both possible. To study him is to be reminded that wars are not only won by bold charges and famous speeches, but also by the patient, unseen work of those who guide the storm from the map table.